Hi, I'm David Brusset with Architecture Here and There, the blog about the style wars in architecture. And you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome back to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. For your audible dining pleasure, today is a sumptuous modernist buffet with author Jane King Hession, talking about Ralph Rapson, Elizabeth Scheu Close, Frank Lloyd Wright, John Howe, and save room for the dessert, a hazelnut Bjarke Ingels, topped with marscapone. Yum! Tune in every day to our Instagram feeds at U.S. Modernist and Mr. Modernism for giveaways of books, including one by our guest. And now, fresh from an hour on the 800 number with FedEx, it's your cranky host, George Smart.
Hi, folks. So frustrating. Don't you love hour-long conversations with customer service, like the one I had recently with FedEx? Have you noticed that the tried and true, trusted for decades FedEx is a little slow lately, if they come at all? We've been sending out through FedEx Ground for 10 years, and in that time, they've never once lost a package. Recently, however, a package going a mere 20 miles took 2 weeks. And they completely lost 4 packages over 3 weeks, including one they admitted to damaging.
You could have walked faster.
I could have walked it over there, absolutely. Yeah. What did FedEx do with my damaged package? Did they call? Did they email? No, they threw it away. Evidently, that's their official policy. Some accountant figured out it was cheaper to toss damaged packages and pay the claims than to put a little more tape on the box and actually deliver it.
What was that Tom Hanks movie? Castaway.
Castaway, yeah. Yeah, that's me, stranded on the island with no service. I can't tell you how irritating this is, especially since I've been a huge fan of FedEx pretty much since it started up years ago. I guess when Jeff Bezos' Amazon drones start offering shipping service, I'm going to sign up. Grumble, grumble, grumble.
George, it sounds like you need a few scoops of that Bjarke Ingels stuff we had just to brighten your day.
I do. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from someone who's always on time, Modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In our continuing world of make-believe, modernist realtor Angela Roll was raised on a secluded modernist island in the Amazon, populated only by immortal warrior women with impeccable architectural taste. When architect Le Corbusier crashes his plane into this paradise, Princess Diana is too busy teaching a soul cycle class and sends Angela to deal with him. Le Corbusier, after ranting in French about how Americans have no style,
Mon Dieu,
encourages Angela to leave the all-female sanctuary to enter the cynical world of gabled roofs and men. For the first time. Ever since on a mission to defend modernism, Angela deals with unreasonable sellers, unrealistic buyers, incompetent builders, and bureaucratic city councils, while hoping to unlock the potential superpower of modernism the world has yet to fully appreciate. Modernist realtor Angela Roll is your superhero. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL, or call her at 919-995-0550.
Thank you, Tom. Jane King Hession is a Minneapolis-based architectural writer and historian specializing in mid-century modernism. Naturally, we got her for the show. She was raised in Nyack, New York.
Not known for its modernism.
And lived in L.A.
Very much known for its modernism.
Also Rochester.
A little bit known for its modernism.
And Alexandria, Virginia.
Ah, bingo, direct hit.
With degrees in English and art history and architecture, she is past president of the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy and the Minneapolis Chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians. She's also a founding partner of Modern House Productions, a multimedia company that specializes in art and architectural subjects. Her latest book, published this year, is Elizabeth Scheu Close, A Life in Modern Architecture. And she's also written Frank Lloyd Wright in New York, The Plaza Years, John H. Howe Architect, From Taliesin Apprentice to Master of Organic Design, the Frank Lloyd Wright House in Ebsworth Park, and she produced Right on the Park, Saving the City National Bank and Hotel documentary, which won 2 Telly Awards for the history, biography, and copywriting. And wait, there's more. Minnesotans loved Ralph Rapson, 60 Years of Modern Design, which won the David Gebhard Award, named for the well-known author of L.A. Modernism books. Welcome, Jane.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Tell me about growing up in New York and how you came to love modernist design through Trans World Airlines.
Well, I did grow up in the Hudson River Valley, which is a beautiful part of the world with a lot of beautiful architecture, but as was previously noted, not a lot of modern architecture. But I was fortunate to spend a lot of time in New York City as a child. And on one of those visits, I went to the TWA terminal at what is now Kennedy Airport, and I was just overwhelmed. I mean, I had never seen anything like this. I had seen some great architecture in New York, but this was just completely different. And it felt like the building was what it was about. It felt like it was about flight. It felt like it was about to lift up and take off. And I was just fascinated. And from then on, I think I just really wanted to study architecture and be involved with architecture and see more architecture. And it became a passion of mine.
Were you a Lego girl or anything? Did you start putting things together, or was it more on the drawing side?
No, I had blocks. They weren't Legos, but they were these large blocks, and I did used to build a lot of things. I used to build with cards, too. If there was a cardboard box around, I would transform it into something, usually a residence of some kind. But I was interested in that. And my father also had a shop in our garage in the backyard, and he was always building something. He designed and built a houseboat in our backyard and added a room on the house. And there was always this I had my own workbench in his shop. So, I could always see the possibility of wanting to create something, even though he didn't design TWA terminal, but he did design this houseboat and a lot of doll houses and barns and things for me. So, I understood the connection between design and, wanting to create something and its creation. And I think that was kind of a lasting lesson.
Is that houseboat still around?
No, it's not, unfortunately.
Oh, well.
It was purchased by someone later on who managed to sink it, so it is no longer around. But it was a wonderful part of my childhood, kind of sailing up and down the Hudson River.
Wow.
Were your parents into architecture and took you to places, or did you just kind of tug on their arms and drag them to the places you wanted to go?
They were interested in, we would go interesting places in the city and very often they were of interesting architectural design. But no, neither one was really involved in that. My mother always said she was a frustrated decorator and she liked creating various environments in our house. But no, neither of them was professionally into architecture at all.
And you went straight into English.
I did, because I was in high school. My guidance counselor, who was a very nice man, but was the basketball coach, probably not the right guidance counselor for me, really discouraged me, explained to me that, this was not a field for women. And apparently I didn't have enough belief in myself or whatever to tell him he was wrong. So I did study. That's one of the reasons I had a double major in English and art history, because I studied a lot of architectural history within my art history degree.
And how's your basketball?
Well, actually, it wasn't all that bad when I was in high school, but, I did let that go.
Okay.
Oh, well.
Just checking if maybe some of that career advice rubbed off in a positive way.
No, not really. No.
And when did you go to architecture school? How did you get there?
Well, later in life, I had moved to Minnesota, and I had 2 young children at the time, and I found myself volunteering a lot in architecturally related endeavors, like the Children's Museum. I was an early board member when that was being created in its first location in the Warehouse District in Minneapolis. And at some point, it became clear to me that I could actually turn all these volunteer hours into a graduate degree in architecture because I was spending so much time doing that. So I did. I applied to the University of Minnesota and was accepted and earned my master's in architecture there in the early 90s.
And then you started writing.
Well, I had written before. I had worked in public relations before, so I kind of reverted to writing, but I went to writing about architecture. And actually, my first architecture writing assignment was some research on Ralph Rapson, whom I knew very little about. For the then dean of the school, Harrison Fraker, he asked me to do some research for something he was doing. And that's kind of how I got involved with Ralph Rapson and writing about Ralph Rapson, and then eventually with the exhibitions, the joint exhibitions on Ralph, one of which was at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and one of which was at the Wiseman Art Museum, the first time they ever had a double exhibition. And I had the opportunity to curate one of those exhibitions, and at the same time we were writing the book.
Well, tell us about Ralph Rapson, because he's a name that some people know, but he's not as well known as, say, Frank Lloyd Wright and Richard Neutra.
Ralph was a character. I was very fond of Ralph, as almost everyone who ever met him was. He was a Midwesterner originally, but was born and raised in Michigan, went to Cranbrook Academy of Art on a scholarship because Eliel Saarinen had noticed his drawing ability and gave him a scholarship at Cranbrook Academy of Art. He worked for Liesel Moholy-Nagy at the new Bauhaus in Chicago. He was the head of architectural curriculum there. He taught at MIT. He worked for the Federal Buildings Operation for the U.S. State Department and designed a number of our embassies abroad, including ones that still stand in Stockholm and Copenhagen. And then eventually, he always was both teaching and practicing. And in 1954, he had the opportunity to head the School of Architecture at the University of Minnesota, becoming the third head in its history. And he came to Minnesota then and established a modern architecture practice. He got on the cultural map, and everyone sort of knew Ralph when he designed the Guthrie Theater, which was just a kind of groundbreaking design, and the first time a theater like that had been actually designed for a repertory company. So that was really his big break. That was in 1963, but he was also heading the school. He was designing houses. He was designing churches. So he's extremely well known and was extremely well liked, I believe, in Minnesota.
There's a neighborhood, I believe, isn't it, University Grove, that's full of his houses?
Correct. There are, I don't know, maybe 9 or 10 of his houses there. There are even more by Elizabeth Close in that neighborhood, but it is an enclave of university housing. The land is owned by the university. And one of the stipulations was qualified faculty could lease the land and build a house on it, but they had to be houses designed by architects. So between 1928, I believe, and the early 70s, all these houses, I think there are about 160 of them, all of these were designed by architects. So it's this wonderful little architectural museum almost of houses by noted architects over 40 years.
So let's go to Elizabeth Scheu Close.
Okay.
This is the subject of your most recent book, and it's a name I'm fascinated with.
Right. Well, she was born in Austria and in Vienna to a very well-to-do family. And I first met Liesel. She was known by the name Liesel Close. I first met Liesel Close in probably around 2000 when she was in her late 80s. I knew of her, I had heard of her, but I didn't know a lot about her. And I had the opportunity to do an oral history with her that was sponsored by the Minnesota Historical Society. And I would sit with her in a house that she designed in University Grove for her family, and we would talk. And the more I talked to her, the longer I talked to her, the more fascinated I became, not only by her architecture, but by her life. And she had a most extraordinary life. She was born in Vienna to a well-to-do, well-connected family who had deep social democratic roots. And she grew up in a house designed by Adolf Loos, who was an iconoclastic early modern architect. And her parents were friends of Lowe's, and they commissioned him to build a house, and it actually was built the same year Liesel was born, which was 1912. So in 1912, for a very modern house to be built in this very traditional neighborhood in Vienna was quite extraordinary and very controversial. And what happened was people were attracted to this house. They both hated it and they loved it, but people literally came from all over the world to see it because it was so unique. And a guest book was kept by her mother of all the people who came from around the world to see it. And it's really extraordinary when you realize who was actually in this house, whose conversations, bounced off of the walls of this extraordinary house.
Yeah, I assume that she would have been visited by Neutra and Schindler at some point in that house?
Yep. Neutra for sure. I believe Schindler was there, but also her parents were both political. Her mother was a writer of children's books and a translator of children's books and a publisher of children's books. So there were literary figures that came. There were American authors who came. There were people from the theater world. There were architects and designers. There were people who would perish within the next, 15 to 20 years in concentration camps. So it's a very for me, it was a very poignant, fascinating subject to study because this house drew all these people together for one reason, and then they all went their own separate ways, and some had met very tragic fates.
And was Liesel basically the architect of choice for University Grove? You said she did quite a few.
Well, she did. They did 15 houses in the Grove. She wasn't the architect of choice. Each person could choose who they wanted for their architect, and as long as the plans were met with approval. And for a long time, Winston Close, Liesel's husband, who was the university architect, was the person who was approving these plans. But Liesel and Wynn did build a number of houses there because they were chosen by the people who wanted to build them. They never advertised, but anyone who wanted a modern house, especially in the mid-30s or early 40s, would turn to Wynn and Liesel because they were the only firm in Minnesota who were dedicated to designing modern houses alone.
And could you live in University Grove if you were not on the faculty?
Not at one point. Certain administrators would qualify and tenured faculty members. It's different today. They do give first dibs to anyone who has university connections. But if a house does not sell within a certain period of time, they will open it up to the general public. And
what happened to Liesel? I assume that she's passed away by now?
Liesel died 6 months short of her 100th birthday in June of 2012. And she unfortunately had a rather long decline. She was in a nursing home for some time and in a dementia unit, sadly. But she was well cared for by her family and lived a very, very long life.
And what motivated you to do your most recent book about her?
The more I talked to Liesel and the longer I interviewed her, I realized how fascinating she was. And I just felt that it was kind of a shame that she was not that well known. A lot of other, Ralph was well known. A lot of other architects got quite a bit of press. And I'm very interested in how a person becomes the architect that they become. It doesn't just happen. Architecture isn't created in a vacuum. And I think architects, because of their training, because of their lives, because of their experiences, bring something special to or unique to what they design. And it became clear to me that Liesel went through a lot in her life. She had to leave Vienna because of the rise of Hitler. Her mother was Jewish, was born Jewish, although she did not practice Judaism. It was not a debatable point at the time, so she had to leave Vienna. She went to MIT, and her education was partially funded there by Edward Filene of the Boston department store family.
Filene's basement,
helped her
yeah.
out. Yep, Filene's basement, correct, where she was one of very few women there. Then she tried to get a job in both the Depression and the fact that she was a woman architect. It was very difficult. She was, Neutra, you mentioned earlier, said she could work for him, but she'd have to pay him for the privilege. William Lescaz would not hire her because she'd be a distraction in the drafting room. And then Edward Stoneroff, who was also an emigre, European emigre, hired her. So all of these kind of roadblocks and experiences and shifts in direction that she had to take, I feel made her the determined, unflappable architect that she was. Even her choice of doing primarily residential work was because she was a woman. A lot of people would not hire a woman to do what they considered to be highly technical buildings. So she would eventually do those. But at first, she had to do residential architecture. So her personal story and professional story kind of tracks a lot of major events, cultural, social, political, of the 20th century. And I'm interested in that relationship.
And what are some of the buildings in the Minneapolis area that we might drive by that she designed?
Well, again, largely residences, about 250 of them. And what's wonderful is a lot of them are being discovered by a new generation of homeowners. I'm working with a couple right now who bought an early 60s design of hers and did a meticulous restoration on it. And kind of didn't intend to do that originally, but sort of the longer they were in the house, the more they understood and fell in love with what she had done architecturally. She was interested in reductive architecture. She didn't put anything extra on her building. She said she didn't want to design problems into a building. So she didn't include things like gutters or, window boxes or shutters that would need repair. And they began to appreciate this and also the spatial efficiency of her plans. So it's really nice to see her houses having a second life rather than being knocked down, because as we all know, that's a huge problem with modernism in the world, basically. She also designed, for instance, the Peavey Technical Center, which was a sophisticated laboratory building. Now it's been purchased by a school district, but it still stands. With her husband, Wynne, she designed Ferguson Hall at the University of Minnesota, which is the music building. They were both musicians, so that was a meaningful project for them. Freshwater Institute, it was a biological institute studying problems of freshwater lakes and other bodies of water. I think that was one of her favorite buildings. So there are quite a few that still exist in the Twin Cities.
Let's move on to our entree course. You wrote 2 books about Frank Lloyd Wright, including one on what's called the Plaza Years, which is when he lived in the Plaza in New York City in the last 5 years leading up to his death. What was that time like in Wright's career?
Well, it was, again, as you mentioned, the latter part of his career. He was still pretty feisty and opinionated, and he professed to hate all cities, New York in particular. But in fact, he had been traveling to New York since the 20s. And usually when he was in New York, he'd stay at the Plaza. But at this period, from 54 to 59, the Guggenheim, which had been stalled for a long time, was finally rising. Wright was in his 80s, and he realized he needed a New York base from which to work on the Guggenheim project and to supervise it. So, characteristically, he found what he considered to be the finest suite in the Plaza Hotel, with views up and down Fifth Avenue to Central Park, and he redecorated it and renovated it to suit his needs. So, and he actually loved New York, although he would rarely admit that. It's an interesting period, too, because in addition to the Guggenheim, which is the first and only building of his that stands in the New York skyline, he did a lot of television and radio at the time, and particularly television.
Oh,
and
yes.
To be
he did the Mike Wallace show. He did What's My Line?
Really?
He did.
Yeah.
Yes, he did, which is odd. But he did do What's My Line. And he was totally relaxed. Again, for a man he was born after the Civil War, just after the Civil War, it's extraordinary that he took so well to this media. But he came from a family of preachers, basically. So he was used to proselytizing in some ways. And he realized that, TV would help him get his message out.
Yeah, the Mike Wallace interview of Frank Lloyd Wright is terrific. You can see it on YouTube.
Yes, and my co-author, Deborah Pickrell, and I actually approached Mike Wallace and asked him to write the foreword for the book for that very reason. So we found ourselves in the very unusual position of going to CBS and interviewing Mike Wallace, which was a real turn of the tables kind of thing.
Right.
But he was delightful, charming, and it was a wonderful experience for us.
And did you get that on tape?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good. Because you should save that for the archives.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's move on to our next course, John Howe, which is a name I didn't know. Tell me about John.
You mentioned that you didn't really know who he was, and I think that's true for a lot of people because he did fly under the radar, Wright's radar, for quite some time. At the age of 18, he left Evanston, Illinois, and went to the Taliesin Fellowship, joined the Taliesin Fellowship the very first year, 1932, and he stayed with Wright until after Wright's death, actually. He's best known for organizing Wright's archive, but also he could draw like almost no one else. And many of the very beautiful drawings that came out of the studio were created by John Howe. I would put him up there with Marion Mahoney in terms of his rendering ability, but he was just a superb delineator. However, all drawings, all projects that went out of the Taliesin studio were signed by Wright. So Howe's name was known among the fellowship at the studio, maybe with some clients, but, not generally known until later. He left the Taliesin Fellowship after Wright's death, and in 1964 he came to Minnesota. There was the potential for some clients here, and he and his wife had a weekend cottage not far from where Taliesin was in Spring Green, Wisconsin. So that it felt like a good area for them. And he established a practice. He was in his 50s when he did this, and he worked here for about 25 years doing primarily residential work.
You have had a modernist house yourself. You had a Charles Goodman house in Virginia.
I did. When we lived in Virginia, we lived in a neighborhood called Holland Hills.
Oh, yes. We know Holland Hills.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So, as you know, it's a collection of, 100 and some odd, or probably more than that, modern houses. And we did buy a 1952 custom Charles Goodman house, and it was wonderful. I have to say, the man knew what he was doing, so it was extraordinary to live in this house and kind of spoiled us for almost anything else.
Well, what did you end up in Minnesota?
Well, when we came to Minnesota, in terms of a house, we realized we wanted another modern house. And we couldn't really find one. We couldn't really find what we wanted, so we decided we would build one. And we found a lot in the Morningside neighborhood of Edina, which is 50 by 200 feet, and we challenged our architect friend, Tim Quigley, who was actually one of my professors in architecture school, to design a modern house for us on that site, and so that's where we live right now.
Why is it so small?
The lot?
The lot, yeah.
It's just the way it is. It's just the way it's platted here. I think there used to be, it's a very deep lot, and they probably were farmhouses on these lots originally or something, and they just did divide them this way.
Okay.
People used to build smaller houses.
Yes.
But ours is very long and narrow, and we feel it works pretty well.
In addition to writing books, you also are producing films with Modern House Productions?
Well, yes. My husband, Bill Olexi, is a photographer and a videographer who worked in television and for the government for many years. And when we came out here, we decided to work together and see what we could produce. And he does a lot of architectural photography, but we did have the opportunity to do a documentary on the Park Inn Hotel in Mason City, Iowa, which was designed by Wright in the early teens. And it was almost was knocked down, but it was fantastically restored by a dedicated group of people in Mason City. So that's what the documentary was about, both the history and the restoration of this building.
And do you have another film in production now?
No, This Liesel Close book took me a very long time to do, and I'm in the process of kind of sitting back and reflecting on what to do next. I have to say, releasing a book in the middle of a pandemic is not the ideal condition, so I'm not clear how to move forward with this book. There's been very little press, publicity. All of the events have been canceled, of course. So I'm
but
still
you're
kind of
on our
focused.
podcast.
Yeah,
I know, and
there's
I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's just not been the best time to do this. So I think all of that is delayed a little bit, and I'd like to focus on raising the interest. The other thing I'm working on with an architect in Vienna by the name of Judith Abelmeier, a female architect, is trying to bring Liesel back to Vienna because she is unknown there. No one knows who she is. They know her family, but her work and her career as an architect are unknown. So we're trying to have the book translated into German and to perhaps have the exhibition that I curated sent to Vienna as well.
That would be fantastic.
Yes, wouldn't it? So we hope that will happen.
Even in Vienna, people that are well-known, like Adolf Loesch, are not that well-known in Vienna because he's been gone so long.
That's true. That is true. And, Vienna lost a whole as many European countries did, lost a whole generation of people working in architecture who were forced to leave the country. So in a way that, there's a big hole in the history of architecture and other cultural fields in Vienna.
Well, Jane, since you're looking for something to do, we have a suggestion for you, and this gets us to our dessert course. We need a good book on Bjarke Ingels. Do you know Bjarke Ingels?
Not well, I have to admit.
There have been several films about him in the last few years, but I'm not familiar on a book that has actually come out yet. He is probably the most well-known architect in the world, one of the most successful right now. His firm, BIG, B-I-G, is turning out about one major project a week between his offices in New York and Copenhagen, and I think someplace else. We're huge fans of Bjarke Ingels. Obviously, because the angels sing whenever we mention his name. But, that might be something you might want to pursue, just saying.
I'll make a note of that. I don't expect angels to accompany this mention, but University Grove is something that also interests me. So perhaps I can revisit some of those great houses there.
That would be spectacular. I think University Grove is a wonderful neighborhood. I was going to visit this year, and of course that's gotten canceled. Mm-hmm. But it's on my future bucket list for architecture.
Well, I think all of us have, our buckets are overflowing with things that we just can't wait to do and travel we can't wait to take. So it's kind of a time, I think, of, fantasizing and planning and salivating over some of these possibilities, and hopefully soon we'll be able to realize them.
Jane, this has been a delicious treat talking about all these great architects. You are such an expert, and this has been delightful. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for modernist houses. Okay, Tom, close us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 7,500 significant modernist houses, and access 3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Carrie Cesarino researches guests while juggling 2 above-average children, a flaming sword, and somehow a bottle of Dom Perignon 1963. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another delicious, yet nutritionally healthy, modernist design buffet edition of U.S. Modernist Radio, not sponsored by FedEx.
Check, please.